Every Peep Show fan's dream is probably to find an episode that they've just never seen before, an extra helping of Mark and Jeremy that they've somehow missed and is just waiting for them. Well, I'm sorry to say that doesn't really exist, but what I am going to be talking about today is probably the next best thing. Mark and Sophie in Paris was an episode of Peep Show that was never made. Well, kind of never made. It's a long story. The story that is first spoken about in this book here, Peep Show, The Scripts and More by Sam Bain and Jesse Armstrong, the writers of Peep Show. It's a really interesting thing to own, but it's the "and more" part of the title that interests us in regard to Mark and Sophie in Paris. This book includes all of the scripts of the show up to the end of Series 5, and then includes this section at the back, titled The Genesis of an Episode, which talks about how an episode of Peep Show is written from start to finish and all of the changes and modifications that occur along the way. And the episode that is used as an example here is Series 3 Episode 6, that would eventually become to be what we all know today as Quantocking, the episode in which Mark accidentally proposes to Sophie and gets lost on the moors at night. This chapter of the book goes over how this episode reached its eventual form from how it started out as, and the concept that it started out as? That was indeed Mark and Sophie in Paris. Well, the first draft of the episode was titled Mark and Sophie in Paris, with the first writer of the script being instead titled Honeymooning, fitting in with the trend of every episode in Series 3 ending with the suffix ing for some reason. As you can probably guess, this episode involved Mark and Sophie going to Paris, but actually a lot more than that too. The subplot of this episode involved Johnson and Tony getting married. That should sound really fucking strange for any Peep Show fans, because Johnson never met Tony a single time in any episode we've ever seen. But as this was the proposed last episode of Series 3, this would have been a relationship that was expanded upon in the other episodes of Series 3 that never were. Elizabeth Marmer, who played Tony, wasn't even in any episodes after Series 2, which this book says is because she, as well as Rachel Blanchard, who played Nancy, was simply unavailable at the time, but the writers didn't know this at this point. So Alan Johnson and Tony are getting married, but prior to this we have Johnson's stag do, organised by the best man, Mark, which involves paintballing whilst in go-karts, something I believe is actually referenced in an episode of the show at some point, but I can't remember in which one. Jeremy, Superhands, and Tony's ex-husband Tony are all also there, as an attempt to humiliate them over the fact that he has won her. Johnson, a recovering alcoholic as the show hinted at, has a drink at the stag do. Dun dun dun! As the episode goes on, Jeremy and Johnson bond, with Johnson being much happier and more laid back than normal, but as the episode goes on, it becomes obvious that Johnson has started drinking again, and his alcoholism is what causes him to be a more fun person. Jez becomes his friend / helper, helping him do his job at JLB, and writes an important speech for him to give, but as the alcoholism becomes more obvious, Tony dumps Johnson and then leaves the show. Jez and Nancy bond again over their attempts to help Johnson, and the pair end up happy, whilst he and Tony go their separate ways. So that's quite a lot actually happening there. But that's not even the real meat and potatoes of the episode, with that instead being the actual Mark and Sophie in Paris half of the script. Mark and Sophie are drifting apart from each other, so to try and win her back, Mark invites her on a weekend romantic trip to Paris, to which she agrees, but says she mustn't bring his phone because she doesn't want work getting in the way of things. He agrees, but secretly brings it anyway. In Paris, there was a mix-up with their hotel, so Mark has to pay £400 for another one, which annoys him a lot. They later meet a weird couple at a restaurant who unnerve Mark, and later get drunk and go back to their flat together. They offer to let the pair stay at their flat. Sophie wants to, and so Mark does, thus having wasted the £400 he spent on the hotel, which causes an argument. The next day, Mark secretly checks his phone and finds messages from Jez saying that Johnson, presumably after breaking up with Tony, is suicidal and is threatening to kill himself. Mark can't tell Sophie, all she'll know he has his phone with him, so she doesn't tell her, but instead keeps worrying about Johnson and subsequently ruining his fun and enjoyment of the trip to Paris. Mark and Sophie return home later, and Jez tells him that Johnson is in hospital after having an overdose. Sophie overhears and thus knows that Mark has known about Johnson's issues for over a day by this point and yet didn't say anything, and is therefore extremely annoyed and presumably walks away from him. The episode ends there. Wow. So as is probably apparent, this episode is completely different to the one it eventually turned into, Quantocking, and actually has some huge character moments in it. Johnson becoming fun, relapsing on his alcoholism, and then trying to kill himself. Tonally, all of that feels so very different to what you'd expect in an episode of Peep Show. Series 3 must have looked so much different initially for this to have been its conclusion. As I said before, it was going to include Nancy and Tony. Johnson and Tony would have somehow started dating. The book says Nancy was living with Tony, Superhands and Johnson obviously interact to some degree. It's incredibly different. The show would have gone in such an unrecognisable direction had this been what actually went into production. While some scenes in this draft do sound really great, and I would have loved to have seen them, like the go-kart paintballing and the Jeremy Johnson friendship stuff, I am just so glad that the show didn't actually use this draft. It's so dour and bleak. The show isn't as deep or heavy as the themes this draft was trying to push are. Alan Johnson trying to kill himself by overdosing because his fiancée left him due to him regressing on his alcoholism. It could be played well as a black comedy, sure, but I don't think that Peep Show is the right place to have gags revolving around a topic like that. But I'm not alone in thinking this. In the book, Sam and Jesse say that the script committee didn't like this draft at all and essentially told them to start completely over again. They described the draft's reception as a cold shower of criticism, and I can definitely see why. They highlighted also that one of the main issues with this plot is that Mark and Jez are inherently distant from each other due to Mark being in Paris, and so aside from the initial stag party scene and then them meeting up later at the end of the episode, the two would have almost no interaction for the entire episode. Mark and Jez scenes are what make the world of Peep Show turn, so intentionally having them have such a small amount of contact feels reductive, especially in a series finale like this. So Sam and Jesse went away and came back with the second draft. Sticking with the titles ending with the suffix ing at the end, this episode was titled Mountaineering, and involved Mark and Jez getting lost up a mountain, or rather, I suppose, more accurately a hill. And where is this hill exactly? Why, it's in the Quantox, which we know is the setting used in the actual Series 3 Episode 6 finale, Quantocking. So this second draft here certainly is a lot closer to the final product than the whole Mark and Sophie in Paris idea. However, there are still some huge plot differences here, so let's go over them. Mountaineering's draft starts off like how the episode ended up. Mark wants to ask Sophie to marry him, says he's going to the Quantox to do it, and Jez wants to bring Big Suze along too, but that doesn't happen, so Superhands ends up going in tow instead. Just before they're all about to leave for the Quantox, Jez goes next door to check on Tony, who looks rough. She sat in the bath, fully clothed, drinking in the day, because she has just returned from the funny farm, read mental institution, after splitting up with a doctor boyfriend of hers. So because Jez is worried about her, they get Tony to come with them to the Quantox too. So going to the Quantox is Mark, Sophie, Jez, Hans and Tony. Jez and Hans' goal whilst on the trip is to make their own porn film. This is written as though them having theorised this has been a joke within the series, by the way. Those two and Tony are at a pub, scouring for girls to invite to their porn shoot, but Jez chickens out on asking anyone to join them because it just feels wrong to him. But then one of the girls in the pub comes up and talks to Jeremy, and that girl, it's Mary. Now I should note here that this script, nor any of the emails in the book outlining its development, clarify whether this Mary is the one from the sectioning episode in the actual finalised Series 3 or not. I guess they had the idea in mind of a character named Mary and were just throwing her into random episodes at this point, as it's highly unlikely that the boys would run into two different characters named Mary. And in case it's not clear with the way I'm saying it, her name is Merry, M-E-R-R-Y, as in Merry Christmas everyone, not Mary as in, well, Mary. Mark and Sophie are in the pub, and Mark gets tricked into spending £175 on a bottle of wine. He wants to argue back and change his order, but out of social reservedness, he doesn't. This is basically the exact same interaction that happens with Jez and Suze in Series 5. Sophie gets talking to a hippie couple on the table next to them too, and Mark obviously doesn't like this. Scene 6, Jez and Mary are in the hotel room and are almost getting off. There's a chemistry and they bond, but nothing's quite happening yet, and she gets up to go to the bathroom for a second. Hans busts out of the wardrobe holding a camera. He was filming them in secret the whole time, as though this was to be the basis of their porn film without her realising. Cut back to Mark, Sophie and weird hippie couple. The couple invite Mark and Sophie back to their hot tub. Mark really doesn't want to go because he's planned out exactly when to propose to Sophie, and this would obviously mess up his plans. She really doesn't want to leave them though, and so Mark leaves Sophie with the pair and leaves saying that he wants to watch The Apprentice final. Back to Jez and Mary. They're almost getting off again, but Jez is really hesitant to do anything with her in the bedroom. He can't say why, because it's the fact that Hans is filming her against her will from the wardrobe, and so Mary eventually finds Hans and they start kicking each other. End scene. Now here's where the episode kind of converges into the one we know today. Mark is drinking at the bar by himself and calls Jez for support, who as it turns out is just sat over on the other side of the room. They talk for a bit, and then Sophie calls Mark saying she went off with the hippies onto the moors, but they left her and now she's scared and alone, so Mark and Jez go off to try and rescue her. There's pretty much the same dialogue points as in the final episode here. Mark and Jez squabble over their plans to find Sophie, rationing, and eventual directions, but also their conversations lead to Mark realising that he doesn't have to propose to Sophie, and so Mark finally feels free. The pair split up, like in the Quantucking episode, and then it cuts to the next day. Jez is in his bedroom alongside Tony and Hans once again tries to pressure Jez into filming porn for him. This time he wants Jez to pluck his double bass for £100. Jez declines. Jez is later eating breakfast, and Sophie comes in worried, asking where Mark is as he didn't return back last night. Jez says he got lost on the moors, and, bang on time, Mark walks in all unkempt. Then, to add insult to injury, Sophie found the ring that he was going to give her, and so she accepts his indirect, now regretful proposal. Mark is obviously shell-shocked. Cut to Mary at reception. She's crying because she went over on her bill and has no money left, and thus they won't give her back her passport. So I guess this Mary is also Canadian, like the one we eventually saw too. She really needs money, and Jez says he might be able to get a hold of some cash for her later, to which she's thankful for. Jez is now dressed up as a cowboy on a bed, being filmed by Hans and Tony. He's masturbating on camera for money, but really isn't putting in any effort as he feels degraded. He's doing this all for Mary, but Hans is annoyed by him, saying there's no market for his lazy work. Cut to later on, Jez tells Mary he finally has the money to pay her bill, but then she says she rang her dad and he paid the bill for her instead, so Jez essentially films some cowboy porn for nothing. She says to spend the money he offered her on drinks instead, and Hans tells him not to spunk it up the wall, to which Jez is shocked at. That would have been a really good joke here. Then the episode ends with the same interaction that the real episode ends with, Jez finding out Mark accidentally got engaged and was too scared to do anything about it, to which Mark says that he'd be grateful if Jez never mentioned it again for the rest of his life. Okay, so that episode is somewhat recognisable as Quantucking, but there are obviously big differences there. Mainly Jez's side of the episode. There's the whole porn shoot subplot, the inclusion of Tony and I guess Canadian Mary, as well as no big Sues. To be honest, I'm glad these elements were changed though. It doesn't really flow that well in my opinion, and the porn shoot feels a bit too, I don't know, vulgar, on the nose for Peep Show. The script editors felt the same way, hence why this part was changed once again into the Super Hands going drug-free idea that we eventually got. This episode feels disjointed because some of the characters feel quite pointless. Tony especially, you can probably tell by the fact that I barely mentioned her, shows that she does almost nothing in this episode, and doesn't really feel like she belongs in it. Mary's role could have also easily been filled by an existing character instead of introducing her for the first time here. Well, what I assume would be the first time. The Mark and Sophie stuff works well, and is for the most part unchanged, with the weird hippie couple from this draft being what eventually became Gerard and Isabel from the restaurant. Even dialogue-wise, which I didn't really cover, Mark and Sophie's stuff was pretty finalised at this point, which kind of makes sense, as the episode was obviously written with them in mind, and then had the Jez and Hans subplot kind of worked around it. It's interesting just how much the two drafts changed. The first had Alan Johnson play a huge part, to the point where the series finale was about him pretty much, whereas here he isn't even mentioned once. It just makes me curious as to how much the rest of the series was changed too, as obviously you can't just edit the script to the final episode, as all 5 episodes prior in the series would have had repercussions on this one, so the whole series would have probably looked so much different initially. On Mark's side, it went from being about Mark and Sophie going to Paris to Mark and Sophie getting engaged in the Quantox. But for Jez, it went from being about becoming friends with Alan and helping him despite his alcoholism, to helping a depressed alcoholic Tony, filming a porn film and bonding with Mary, to helping Hans get sober and getting with Big Suze in the actual Quantucking episode. There's some really big changes for Jeremy's side there. Also, now looking back at this, Sam and Jesse were really asphyxiated on this idea of characters being depressed alcoholics in the series, weren't they? Tony and Johnson. Seems kind of weird considering that this idea is normally played in a more jokey way in the show, like in Series 1 Episode 5 where it happens to Mark. But whatever, I think it's interesting just to see how far the script developed from what it was initially. And I hope that was interesting for you too, as this isn't very well documented online from what I can tell. I wonder how many people are even aware of this Mark and Sophie in Paris idea anyway. I'm not sure, but hopefully a few more now. So thanks for watching.